All right. So, hi, everyone. I'm today's co host, Zuri Harvell. And as we know, women of all ethnicities and races are held to what oftentimes is an unrealistic standard of beauty, many of which are rooted in the glorification of the European aesthetic. Last Friday, my sister and my mom chatted with two Afro Latinx students about anti Blackness within the Latinx community. Today, we're going to have a female-focused Afro-Latinidad conversation with two female Afro-Latinx students. I'll let the two of you introduce yourselves.
Um, hi everyone. My name's Maya Machado. I go to Spelman College. I'm a senior sociology and anthropology and Spanish double major, and I'm representing Panama.
Hi everyone, my name is Zula Oliveira. I am a sophomore political science major, Spanish minor at Clark Atlanta University. I am from West Orange, New Jersey, and I'm representing Brazil, Cuba, and Dominican Republic.
And I'm just curious, Maya, where did you grow up?
I grew up in Atlanta and Metro Atlanta.
Okay, so what high school did you go to?
I went to Chattahoochee High School.
And Zula, what high school did you go to?
Madison High School.
Okay. So before we get into the conversation, I talked about this on last Friday's episode, but I want to begin this episode this way again, because I think it's always important to emphasize this point as we go into this type of conversation. So Spain was a major player in the transatlantic slave trade. Spain had a very long history with slave trade from Africa, predating the conquest of the Americas. Then in August 1518, King Charles I authorized Spain to ship enslaved people directly from Africa to the Americas without going through a European port first. And then after that, transatlantic voyages with enslaved Africans rose dramatically. Over 90% of enslaved Africans were brought to the Caribbean and South America. Only about 6% of African captives were sent directly to British North America. And the Spanish colonies in the Caribbean were among the last to abolish slavery. I'm going to just say that again since I kind of stumbled a little bit. The Spanish colonies in the Caribbean were among the last to abolish slavery. So I wanted to just put that out there again before we start our conversation. All right, so here we go.
So to reference last Friday's episode again, they discussed an Instagram meme that went viral in 2018. It was created by an Afro-Indigenous writer and activist named Alan Paleza Lopez. Remezcla published an article named When It Comes to Latinidad, Who is Included and Who Isn't? A large percentage identifying as Afro-Latinx or Indigenous championed Lopez's meme and called for cancellation. Others, many whom would be racialized as white or mixed race Latinx, contested the message. Do you feel included in Latinidad?
That's a very interesting question. I would say within my Latinx community here in New Jersey, I would say I feel included. My family and, my growing up, I spent about 4 or 5 years of my childhood in Brazil. And as you know, Brazil has the highest population of Black people outside of Africa. So I always felt included because that's who I am. And, being a Brazilian citizen, I always felt included within my community. But I think when it comes to the American point of view, they may not see Black Latinx people as Latinx. And I think that's a problem.
In my experience, I have not. Just because growing up, most of the Latinx community here is either Mexican or Central American. And in their countries, Afro-Latinx people aren't as common, or most of them have not really seen a lot of Afro-Latinx people. So, when they see me, they don't automatically think, oh, maybe she's from our country or she's from another Latinx country. So they would always kind of exclude me or kind of act like I'm not a part of the community just based on my appearance. So if it did come up in conversation that I am Panamanian, they would kind of be surprised and kind of be like, oh, you're one of us? I didn't know that. And it's just kind of uncomfortable because I never really felt accepted within that community. However, when it was like any kind of family gathering, any kind of Panamanian gathering, and a lot of the Panamanian gatherings would be Afro-Panamanian gatherings, because that's, my people, that's my community, my family's community. I definitely felt accepted, especially like the kids and the younger generation. We would all like talk about our stories about how people wouldn't believe us when we said, we're Panamanian. And if we were speaking Spanish, other Latinos would be very like surprised, and they would just kind of act weird around us. So definitely, I'd say in the grand scheme of things, I have not, and honestly, still to this day, don't feel as included in the Latinx community. And growing up, I felt that even stronger.
Yeah, that seems to be, that's definitely something that I've heard from other Afro Latinx folks. When you look at what is exported culturally from Latin America in terms of music, film, how brands market, how they advertise, there's a very singular image of what the Latinx community looks like. And it doesn't really represent the diversity of the community. It doesn't, in my opinion, doesn't represent women who look like you. 2 Mondays ago, I chatted with a sociology professor named Dr. Katie Acosta. She's Afro-Dominican and at Georgia State. She said, and she echoed your sentiment, Maya. She said there have been times where she's speaking to someone from the Latinx community and they've said to her, oh, I didn't know there were Latinas that look like you. Conversely, we chatted with an Afro-Latinx student from FAMU last Friday. She has an Afro-Dominican father, and she has an Afro-Dominican mother, and her dad is white Cuban. She said she never feels excluded from Latinidad. She said because she's biracial, lighter skinned, she never feels excluded, but it's a privilege that she acknowledges. As I was researching for this episode, it seems like what exists, because the reality is that colorism exists in all of the communities that have been touched by European colonialism, right? Like, you see it in, definitely in the Southeast Asian community with their lightening creams and things like that. So it's nothing sort of, I think, unique to colonized peoples. But I feel this is just from my point of view, it's almost like it's more than colorism in the Latin American community. It's almost like an erasure, like a lack of acknowledgement that Black Latinx and Black Latinas even exist. Do you share this sentiment? And if so, how has the weight of this impacted you? And I also want to know, as a woman, do you find yourself feeling as a Latina, you're being measured next to this mestiza standard?
I definitely do, because I guess the majority of the Latinx community that I've come across in the South of the US and even on the West Coast too, the image is definitely more lighter skin, straight hair. It's not really inclusive to everyone. It's really kind of like the Latinx community is really divided by mestizo versus Black versus anyone else. So when they say that, oh, this is the Latina standard of beauty, they're really saying it's the mestizo/white standard of beauty. And it sucks that that's like kind of like the overall standard that everyone's supposed to like aspire to, when it only applies to like a select few group of people. So growing up, I feel like I did have some identity issues with that, with like the image that I was supposed to ascribe to. And I tried, straightening my hair a certain way. I tried like dressing a certain way that wasn't really true to myself or where I come from. So it definitely like messed up the ways that I saw myself, and like the way that I saw myself as beautiful, which in the past I really didn't. And because of the standard of beauty, I definitely started looking at myself negatively, specifically like my Black features. Like my nose, my lips, my hair, my body, physique, like everything about me. I just looked at it negatively, kind of like, oh, I can't be a part of this community because I don't look like this. Like, why do I look like this? It really messed up with my sense of self-worth and self-love.
So on my end, I always felt, I never felt uncomfortable in my Latinidad. I never felt like I wasn't Latina enough. My mother, she's a very important figure in my life, and my mother's always been my role model. And, although she is darker skinned, she kind of has that experience with people, and people tell her you don't look Latina, or you don't embody what a Latina is. But my father is light skinned, so I'm kind of like in between their two colors. And so I never felt like I wasn't Latina enough. People always tell me you look Brazilian, or because you have curly hair, or you look this type of way. And they compare me to what they think the Brazilian standard of beauty is. And although I feel like I can benefit from that, I don't think it's right. I feel like everyone, no matter what they look like, should feel included in their community. But I've also heard that like people don't think I'm Black enough. And when I tell them that I'm mixed with several different nationalities, they're like, "Oh, you're not one of us. You're one of those Latinas." And they kind of dismiss my Blackness while validating my Latinidad.
Right. So both of you kind of did like a partial definition, but can you both fully define what mestiza is for our listeners?
Mestizo is someone that is of mixed race. That could be like you have one parent of one race and one parent of another race, like Asian and Black or white and Black. But usually it's white and Black. But it could also mean that you look mixed. So there's some people who are lighter skinned or have light eyes or like 3C hair, and they say that you look mestizo or mulatto. But both of your parents could be Black. So it's more so of a mixed race look.
Yeah, and I think traditionally it's also been used to describe people that are of indigenous and European heritage. And that definition is like really common in Mexico and Central America, especially Mexico. That's kind of like where the term emerged from, I think. But
yeah. So an example of a mestiza would be Jennifer Lopez. Would that be, yeah? Okay. So this certainly isn't in anyone's imagination. And according to an article and research conducted by the Pew Research Center, Hispanics with darker skin are more likely to experience discrimination than those with lighter skin. It's not a crazy thing.
Yeah.
Latinos with darker skin are more likely than those with lighter skin to report a specific incident of discrimination. A majority of Latinos with darker skin colors, about 55%, say that because of their race or their ethnicity, people have acted as if they were not smart, compared to the 36% of Latinos with a lighter skin color. Similarly, about half of Latinos with darker skin, about 53%, say they have been subjected to slurs or jokes, compared to about a third of those with lighter color skin, about 34%. So these differences in experiences with discrimination hold even after controlling for characteristics such as gender, age, education, and whether or not they are a natural-born US citizen or were they born abroad. I think it's a pretty universal experience, whether you're ethnically Hispanic or not, that the darker you are, the more discrimination you face. There have been many studies that show that lighter-skinned Black women receive lighter prison sentences. People with lighter skin are compensated better than their darker-skinned counterparts. And there was even a study done that showed that Black people with more education are remembered as being lighter than they actually are. And I actually think that's something that we can say we've seen in like paintings and just like renderings of pictures of Black people and seeing them as lighter than they actually are. But what about your family? Have you ever been discriminated against or made to feel uncomfortable by people within your own family because you're Black?
I would say no, definitely not, because my whole family is Black. They're all Afro-Latino and Afro-Caribbean. My mom's also from the Bahamas. So there's never been like any type of discrimination, like just for being Afro-Latino. I would say like the only discrimination definitely comes from like outside of our community, specifically like non-Afro Latinos. So yeah, we're very like proud of being Black. We're very proud of who we are, and we've always been like that. Like we've always been raised to, love ourselves, appreciate our culture, appreciate where we come from, and to not hide it. Just to be openly yourself, to not be ashamed of being a Black Latino.
And just to clarify, you said the discrimination that you have experienced are from non-Afro Latinos. So are you saying Latinos who are not Black?
Yes.
Okay. And then what is that discrimination like?
I would say it's more like just not being as accepted, as welcomed, as open with us Afro Latinos. But I've had like small interactions with people that are not Afro Latino but are still Latino, and they just kind of they never assume that we're Latino unless we speak Spanish or if they happen to read my name. But they're just kind of like keep to themselves, and then once they discover that I'm also a part of that community or that my family's a part of that community, then things change. Then it's like, oh, hey family, I didn't know you were one of us. So I don't know, just like stuff like that.
Yes, I definitely get the name thing, Maya. I mean, my entire name is a fusion of Portuguese and Spanish. So whenever I was in high school or wherever and I said my name, people immediately knew that I wasn't American. And so I never really experienced that type of discrimination from other Latinos because they knew from the jump like what I was. But I would say on my mom's side of the family, we're all Black. Everyone's Afro Latino on my mom's side of the family. But on my dad's side, there's a lot of miscegenation going on that side of the family. Brazil has a history of racial mixing. And so we have indigenous Brazilians on my side. We have Portuguese, we have Swiss. I think there's even a little bit of like Japanese mixed in there. So within my family, there's a lot of different colors. And I would hear ignorant comments here and there as a child. And I didn't really know what they meant. But now that I'm older, I realized there was a lot of problematic things going on. And I kind of sit and reflect and like, wow, my family really thinks that way. But, you can't control everybody's ignorance.
What do you mean?
So the whole thing, like the texturism that goes on in the Afro Latino community, I would hear a lot about like, oh, her hair is nice or her hair isn't. And like the aunts and uncles comparing the cousins and the siblings because one was lighter than the other or one fit the beauty standard more than the other did. And I didn't really notice it as a child, but now that I'm older, I do realize that that's something that families need to talk about. And we kind of need to erase those stereotypes and allow kids to just be themselves.
Yeah. So what Zula was saying about like how her family ranges from different complexions, I have a similar experience. Like my family is mostly either like my complexion or darker. So we haven't really had many, I guess, miscegenation in our line as far as I know of. And I think that because we're around the same complexion, we don't really discriminate against each other because of that reason. And if there is any kind of like colorism or internalized or anything like that happens, it's probably internalized racism from centuries ago, from over the years.
But thank you so much for adding your comment, Maya. I had another question for both of you. Zula, you are newer to the Atlanta University Center community, and Maya, you've been there for about almost 4 years now. Both of you spoke about how you've received any discrimination that you have received has come outside of your community. While being in your college community, do you feel like that's still true within the AUC?
Yeah, definitely. Both my parents went to the AUC. My mother is a graduate of CAU class of 96, and my dad is a graduate of Morehouse College class of 96. And when they were there, they said the Latino community was much smaller. And, when I was preparing to go to the AUC, they were like, Zula, you got to start a Latino club. Like, I know there has to be a few more. And so when I first got here, I had people tell me that I wasn't American. And I explained to them, like, yeah, I'm a Brazilian citizen, but I'm also American. And so trying to explain my dual nationality to people, they just didn't get it. And so they would dismiss my being American a lot. And a lot of people don't know that Afro Latinos exist. So I found myself having to explain myself a lot, which is why I went out of my way to create Afro Latinidad AUC, which is an organization to create a safe space for Afro Latino students so that we don't feel left out of these conversations. And so that we kind of create our own familia within the community.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Zula. I'd say my experience in the AUC has been like very positive as far as like people understanding my background. I'd say like I've had a few instances where people like didn't quite understand like what I was. Like one of my friends freshman year, I told her that my dad's from Panama, and then she was like, "Oh, so are you Spanish?" And I was like, "No, not really."
Spanish people are from Spain.
Yeah, that's something we have to talk about. Yeah.
And it's interesting that she said that because she's from the Bronx and she lives around a lot of Dominicans, and she was telling me how like the Dominicans in her community, like they didn't really associate themselves with Black people, even if they looked Black or even if they were Black, like they totally like did not like Black people at all. And that's what she was telling me. So that's why she had to ask me and clarify me, like, you know, how do I identify? And I was like, yeah, I'm Black. I'm Afro Latina, not Spanish. Like, you know, my family, we all kind of look like my complexion or darker. So, yeah, that was an interesting conversation. And then something that really kind of surprised me was my roommate freshman year. She was telling me about how she was learning about the transatlantic slave trade and how a lot of people were brought to the Caribbean and South America, and how she was like really surprised because like she didn't even know that. And I was like, what? I'm sitting right here.
Right.
Yeah.
That's
like
real. Yeah.
Proof.
I'm sorry,
Yeah.
Zula, were you saying something?
I was saying that like our existence as Afro Latinos is proof that
right.
slave trade happened.
Exactly.
So do you guys feel like the race versus ethnicity type of conversations that you guys have to engage in those a lot in your day-to-day lives, academic setting, however you want to interpret that, but do you feel like that type of conversation is something that occurs a lot because of your Afro Latinx heritage?
I think the further I go into my matriculation, people understand more because they learn more. I understand a lot of people didn't have the education to understand the existence of Black people outside of the United States. But I feel like my professors are always very welcoming to my identity. And I do explain myself here and there, but it's getting better.
Yeah, I agree with you, Zula. I'm in the same boat. Like people, I get questions here and there, but it's like, you know, it's whatever.
Yeah.
I was also going to say, so I graduated from Spelman in 2000. And I think that, you know, I've told my daughters this, and I've mentioned this because we did an episode with 2 Nigerian students who are HBCU students. And I will say it's a couple of things. One, I felt that I did not have to really articulate the difference between my race and my ethnicity. I grew up in Mount Vernon. So sidebar, grew up in Mount Vernon. I'm Jamaican. And where I grew up, mostly everyone was from every place else. So for example, like Zula, you're saying that you never really had that issue, but you grew up in West Orange, New Jersey. That actually is not surprising to me that you and Maya would have 2 completely different experiences. Everyone was from someplace else, right? Like it was like you're African American, you're from the Caribbean, whether it's Spanish speaking, French speaking, British speaking, you're from the Caribbean, you're from the West African, or like your grandparents are from the South. And then like the white people, they were, you know, for the most part, like, you know, they're, you know, 2nd generation American, Italians, you know, Irish, or they're like Jewish, right? They're like Ashkenazi Jews. They're from like Germany, like Poland, all of that. So just growing up in New York, that was, you know, everybody's from someplace else. Like, you know, I know like Zuri was saying, they have like Juve and things like that. Like we never had anything like that when I was in school. Like I remember having to sort of like explain to people like, I am Black. I'm not African American. Like African American is a specific ethnicity. You know, you have your foods and the way you celebrate, like, you know, like if I had a funeral, my funeral would more than likely be in Jamaica, like yours might be in North Carolina. Like slavery existed in other places other than the United States. Okay. I didn't have that data back when I was in college, like, you know, that Brazil, like, I think that there's a lot more language now around the fact that like Brazil has the highest amount of Black people outside of Nigeria, and like all of this data to kind of like drive the point home. But I will say on the flip side that I think sometimes makes people confused is what Maya brought up, which is when people are Black and Latino, they'll say things like, I'm Spanish, right? Like trying to make themselves, in my opinion, that's like an internalization of you trying to like make yourself proximal to Europeans, because you're not Spanish. Spanish people are from Spain, right? Like I'm not British, right?
Yeah.
Or people saying like, I'm Dominican, or I'm Puerto Rican, I'm not Black. Well, you can be Black and be from anywhere. So I do think if there is a double-edged sword to that, where, you know, you were saying, Maya, you knew someone who grew up in the Bronx who was around a bunch of Dominicans, and she, I mean, I can't speak for her, but she probably was surprised that you identified as Black. So I don't know what specifically she was confused about, because it's hard for me to believe that somebody from the Bronx cannot articulate or can't, like a Black Latino would be abstract to them, just because there's so many in the Bronx, right? But I do know that, like, in the Bronx, many Afro Latinos do not identify as Black. They see Black as being African American. So I'm not trying to take up a lot of space, but I think that there's also like two parts to that as well. But then you have people like Zoe Saldana, right? Like Zoe Saldana is Black. I don't care how she identifies, she is Black. She has a Puerto Rican parent, she has a Dominican parent, and she's phenotypically Black. Yeah. And she she recently did a interview. I can't remember who it was with, but she was responding to this. There was backlash about her playing Nina Simone, who was a dark-skinned woman, and she was like, "Oh, I should have used my power." Yeah, I should have used my power to make sure she was played by a Black woman. Well, Zoe, you are Black. I think and again, I think that was a complicated issue, just because there was there is always a lot of policing around Blackness, and it is so nauseating. I call them diaspora police. But it's like, there was some pushback, but to me, I felt like the more sort of like pushback that made sense was the fact that Zoe is so light, and Nina Simone spent so much time talking about like her dark skinnedness and her, her wide nose and things like that. And like Zoe had to put on prosthetics to have a wide nose. Like they had to like put on makeup to make her darker. Like that is the part that's problematic, not that you aren't Black. So I think that there tends to be, I think that like other people sort of not recognizing Blackness, I think there's like a lot of complicated things. I actually have a question. In what ways, whether it's through uncomfortable conversations or correcting people, in what ways are you ensuring you and people who look like you are included in Latinidad?
I'm not usually in spaces where there's a lot of non-Afro Latinx people, but I do kind of notice that when I am around them, there's usually no like representation of Afro Latinx people, whether it's in like the context of the conversation, or maybe like they'll kind of separate Black people from their conversation as if some of those Black people aren't also a part of their conversations.
Let's say the way I make sure people feel seen, I know in high school when we were in social studies class and they're talking about the slave trade, or they're talking about ancient empires in Latin America, like I always made a point to point out that the textbook was racist and they weren't talking about Black people. And my teachers and my peers, they got a little bit like standoffish because I'm not even sure they knew. And so being a person that was Afro Latina, I was like, hey, we need to talk about this because this happened. And like, I was always explaining. And even if I was the only Afro Latina in the room, I wanted to make sure I felt seen, because if you're going to teach history, you need to teach it right. And I think in the AUC, like now with this club that I co-founded with some friends of mine, we're definitely moving in the right direction to make sure people feel seen and welcome.
Absolutely.
I love that. I love all of that. And I actually, you bring up Mexicans. So there was another article that I was looking for, but I found this one first, which I'll just say. So the Afro-Mexican population has long struggled for recognition in an overwhelmingly mestizo country. This year's census, which is being collected throughout March, marks the first time the country is counting its Afro-Mexican population. A 2015 survey from Mexico Statistic Institute estimated that the Afro-Mexican population is at 1.3 million. okay? Observers expect the census to put the current total at around 2 million, okay? So there are Black Mexicans. There was another article I couldn't find, but basically it was in the New York Times, and they were talking about there were some like teeth that anthropologists found, and it was in Mexico, but it was essentially the way that it was dated means that these were like some of the first enslaved Africans to come to the Americas. Like the first enslaved Africans to come to the Americas, they think were in Mexico. So I just, it's just driving the point home that like these people feeling like their culture is being appropriated. Well, guess what? You got like 2 million Black people in Mexico. It's their culture too.
Yes, I'm so glad you brought that up, because I actually got to go to Mexico and go to an Afro-Mexican town as a part of like a study abroad trip. And there were a lot of Afro-Mexican people like in this specific state in Mexico, not so much in the capital city, but kind of like in this area called La Costa Chica. It's like on the coast of Oaxaca and Guerrero. And there's just so much like Afro culture. There's so many Afro people there.
And separately, there is a part of Mexico that celebrates Juneteenth. So I just want to say that too.
Oh, that's very cool.
I remember, I don't have the information here. I was trying to find it, but I don't want to like disrupt the conversation. But there is a part of Mexico that's near Texas. They celebrate Juneteenth. So
hey, Black people, just because they're Black doesn't mean that there's no possible way that they could also be from the same country that you're from or that your people are from. And it's just very, very like, annoying.
Oh, that's okay.
Honestly, because now that I think about it, I remember there was this video of this woman, it was on Twitter, and she was singing, and it was like a mariachi band. She was singing with them. Mm-hmm. She was Black, and she was singing really well. She was just singing with them. She was singing in Spanish. And in the comments, people were like, oh my God, this is cultural appropriation. Why is she singing that? Da, da, da. And it was so annoying because she's Mexican. Like, she was born and raised in Mexico. And it was mostly Mexican people commenting under the comments. And they were like really angry about this. And I was like, y'all know that Black Mexicans exist. Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I saw it.
Yeah.
It was just really frustrating because that was not the first thing that came to their mind. Like, the first thing that came to their mind was like anger at Black people for singing a mariachi song, which is not cultural appropriation, might I add.
I don't know if either of you are familiar with Love and Hip Hop Miami, but there's the artist Amara La Negra, and she has like the really like chocolate skin and like has this really pretty afro. But before we go into her, I wanted to share a couple of other names of Afro Latina celebrities, being like Lala Anthony, who is Puerto Rican, and from my mom's generation, Tatiana Ali, who played Ashley on The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, who is Panamanian, like Maya. So I remember when people were talking about her, they were talking about the fact that I think it was saying like that her afro was like a wig or something, and that like she was using parts of either Hispanic culture, or I don't know if it's her actual culture, that she was appropriating it because it was like, oh, you don't really have hair that's this big, or this is not your actual culture, so why are you singing in this way or presenting yourself in this way? And then she later was talking about the fact that like, I am a Black woman, I do identify as Afro Latina, and just because you don't understand my culture doesn't mean what I'm doing and presenting to the public eye is appropriation or is wrong. So when thinking of situations like this and things that occur probably on a day-to-day basis, what do you think is the best way to go about either educating people on Afro-Latinx culture and the fact that there is so much diversity within the culture itself? And is there a way to, avoid those situations where it's like, do you feel ostracized from your own culture and heritage?
Okay, so I kind of feel like Amara like paved the way for me. I mean, when that season of Love and Hip Hop was airing, I was still in high school, and people were always invalidating my existence. And I'm like, but look at Love and Hip Hop. I'm like, well, I'm just like Amara. She has brown skin and she has big hair, just like I do. And they're kind of stuck. There's nothing they can say. So I love that I can use her existence to validate myself, and it feels good. And I know that she's gone through her trials and tribulations with all the interviews, like the one she had with Charlemagne, and she's been grilled for who she is, and I hate that that had to happen to her. But she has made a space for Black Latina girls to feel comfortable in themselves.
I love that.
But my main point was, I think it's important to acknowledge that the core of Latinx community is Blackness. Of course, it's a mixture, but a lot of what's celebrated and what's shown about Latinx community has very strong African roots, and it often gets whitewashed or erased, and no one really acknowledges it. Like, for example, with reggaeton, a lot of people don't know that reggaeton actually has Afro-Panamanian roots, and people just think that it started in Puerto Rico or that it started, however it started. People just
with
think
Daddy
that,
Yankee.
Yes. Oh my God. It's so annoying. Like, that's not the truth. Like, whenever people say stuff like that, it just makes me actually mad, very annoyed, because the starters, the pioneers of reggaeton were as Black as anyone, as us. But because of their appearance, they didn't really sell in the market.
Yeah, you have people like Jennifer Lopez and Maluma and Rosalia and Karol G.
Yeah.
And I'm like Rosalia is from Spain. Like, what are you doing doing reggaeton? And I'm just like, y'all are taking our culture and whitewashing it. And I'll ask people, what's your favorite reggaeton artist? And they're like, oh, Maluma. I'm like, he is a white Colombian. He's not even from the Caribbean. What?
No, that's interesting of all the points that you guys bring up, because one, I feel like a very big part of white history, specifically American white history, is erasure of everything else that is not them. And then two, rebranding it as their own. I think that's something interesting about the way that food also influences the way people sort of discuss different cultures and what makes them interesting or ties them to other people. But I don't know if you guys have any other comments or thoughts that you want to put out before we end our conversation today. But I have enjoyed talking to both of you so much. So I'm going to open up the floor.
Yeah, I feel like food is definitely rebranded and made whiter. If you just think of acai bowls, I mean, that is indigenous to the Brazilian land and in the Amazonian rainforest. So I actually have family there. The way that they make acai and the way they make acai in Rio, that I grew up eating it. The fact that it's $12 at Starbucks and it tastes nothing like it does in Brazil. And now it's a yoga soccer mom thing. I'm like, this is it has nothing to do with your culture. And then they don't even say it right and they make it differently. And just I saw someone make they called it hamburger empanadas. And they seasoned it like a hamburger and they put ketchup and cheese inside. And it was just, I was a little bit offended. And I feel like a lot of Latin American food is rebranded to Americans, and then it's just erased. And, food is something we hold very near and dear to our heart. And a lot of the food in Latin America is heavily influenced by African spices and traditions and cooking styles. And I feel like food is something that is so personal. I hate to see it rebranded in these ways.
And without, and it's one thing to kind of reinvent something but it's another thing to sort of not acknowledge where it came from.
Yeah.
I think that tends to be the biggest problem. And I'm actually in the show notes, I'm going to find an article for that, to put a link to that. And I also am going to have an article I found an article in the Rolling Stone called Inside Reggaeton's Unsung Black History. So we will put that in the show notes as well.
So our last question that we ask all of our guests, as you know, this podcast is curated by the Iconoclast Dinner Experience. It's your last night on Earth. Where are you eating?
Ooh, I think I would have to go to South Africa. I think it's Cape Town. I heard it's really pretty there. So I would just, have a nice, dinner outside with a view.
Yeah. Is there anything, is there a reason why you chose Cape Town, or just you want to go there, or is there a food or a restaurant that you're I would really try that if I was there?
I really just like the way it looks. Like I was watching Black Mirror once, and I think they filmed it there. Like one of the episodes, San Junipero. It was filmed.
That's such a good episode.
Yeah, I know. It's like my favorite.
I would go downstairs to my kitchen. My mom we're almost completely vegan family. So my mom makes like vegan Afro Latino food all the time.
Yum.
And I love my mom's food. Like literally, I eat my mom's food 3 times a day. If I can never go to a restaurant, I love eating at home. And so I would eat whatever my mom makes.
Is there like a favorite couple of dishes or like a meal that she'll put together that you're like, this is hitting the spot right now?
So her Brazilian rice and beans, and then some like plátanos tostones and some Brazilian farofa and Brazilian greens. That would I would eat.
Yummy.
That sounds great.
Well, thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. We certainly did. I certainly did.
I enjoyed speaking with both of you.
I had so much fun.
Yes, I really enjoyed it.